Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Ffinlo Costain. A new report from the Open University, in collaboration with Riverford Organic Farmers and Costain, explores how employee ownership can address the complex challenges facing the food and farming sector. I spoke to Professor Emma Bell, who led the research at the Open University, and I asked her why employee ownership is important.
So, firstly, Ffinlo, is the question of succession. Farming in the UK is in a moment of crisis. The average age of farmers is 59. The financial pressures that they face are really intense. The price of food is low, the cost of land is high, and they're struggling to break even. There are stories of farmers really struggling all over the UK. And for many of them, that resorts in getting out, in selling up. And the consequences of that are quite significant for food system resilience. Because there's the possibility that they sell up to the highest bidder, that results in investors who are not connected to the land becoming involved in businesses of farming. And so what we end up with is a more and more industrial food and farming system, which is global, not local. And so we have to think about the consequences of this shift, and employee ownership offers a model for exploring a different way of structuring ownership of these businesses.
Presumably, this is also a way of ensuring that farms and farmland stay as farms and farmland.
Absolutely. It's about control. And that brings me to the second point, which is about good work. It's about the conditions of jobs in the industry, which, as we know, are generally characterized by a precarity and insecurity. So it tends to be seasonal migrant workers that the industry depends on. These jobs are often quite low skill and low pay. And so we need to find creative ways to improve employment in the sector, which employee ownership does, partly through building a system of organising that is more participatory. It involves the people who work in the organisation much more actively in its management. Also through the rewards, because there's a sharing of profits. But as we'll come on to talk about, no doubt, in relation to Riverford, there's a whole cultural piece here about training and development and reinvestment in the business, reinvestment in things that the co-owners, the employee owners, care about. And that's a very powerful thing.
And are there environmental and social benefits too?
Absolutely, there are. And this is also related to the ownership question. Who owns the business and what are their interests? So it's very difficult to balance economic and environmental priorities when a business is driven by shareholder capitalism, which drives the demand for return on investment. It's all about return on investment. And what we need here in food and farming businesses are businesses that can also balance social and environmental benefit, so that those things are valued as well as the financial reward. And that can mean also that it's not just about growth. It's not always about making the business as big as it can be or as profitable it can be. It's about balance. So we need different ways of structuring businesses and doing business in order to get there.
The research focused on Riverford Organic Farmers. Why did Riverford want to become employee-owned, and how did they manage that transition?
So Riverford Organic Farmers and Veg Box Company was set up in the 1980s by Guy Singh Watson. And Guy came to the realization that his family was not going to want to inherit the business. That wasn't the direction of travel. And what he really didn't want is for the business to fall into the wrong hands, the sorts of issues that we've just been talking about. And so to avoid that, they started exploring alternatives. And Riverford is unusual in the sense that it is 100% employee owned. A business can be classified as employee owned when it is 25% owned by the employees in the business. So 100% is a big thing to achieve. And it took a long time, from 2006 to 2023. So this is a long process. There's a structural change and a cultural change. Structurally, you might look at it initially and think it's about getting the legal changes in the business in place, and it's about setting up the governance structures. In Riverford's case, the co-owner council and the trust, who sits in parallel alongside the board of directors, who act as the executive managers of the organisation. So those changes have to be planned, and they have to be implemented, and then they have to be supported. So that's a lot of work. But alongside that, and more fundamentally in many senses, is the cultural change, because Riverford was an entrepreneurial business. Guy was a successful, very successful entrepreneur who'd built the business up to a size that we would classify as quite a large business, so over 1,000 employees. And what they had to do was to communicate the change, to take people with them in that transition, and to make sure that everyone understood the values of the business, that they weren't just in Guy's head. And so there's a huge amount of communication and consultation that took place to make that successful.
What does employee ownership mean for individual employees? Do they have to buy into the company, or do they become employee owners simply by virtue of being employed by the company?
So they become employee owners once the change comes into effect. But in order to make this successful, there's a lot of training and development. For example, in making sure that you move from a quite directive form of management where people are told what to do, to a much more participatory and engaged form of management where people feel that they have a stake in the business and it's their responsibility to help it to improve. And that's where the role of the council comes in, because those are democratically elected councillors who represent the wider group of employee owners, and they bring issues to conversations with the chief executive and the other directors, and they have real power. They have real power in that relationship. So that's where it's a mindset as well as something that exists on paper.
Clearly, there are advantages for the employees, but are there also financial risks for them on a day-to-day basis?
One of the key issues to understand is the difference between a cooperative and an employee-owned business. And in a lot of cases, there is an ambiguity, a lack of understanding about that. And sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. And Riverford they looked at cooperative structure, and they decided against it. And they decided against it because co-ops are a consensus model of organising. Everyone has to agree. Whereas what you have in employee ownership is a participatory model, which means that there are still decision makers, there are still managers, and they are rewarded differently, and there is still a hierarchy. But they are, to a greater extent, accountable to the co-owners. And that is where you balance the risks. So you have the protection. It means that Riverford could never be subject to a sale that would remove the control from the people who run it. But at the same time, you have a greater ability to make quick decisions where you need to. And this is a fast moving business with tight margins where that is needed.
Why don't more companies do this? What are the key disincentives to employee ownership?
Well, I think one of them is a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness about this model. And that's something that our research and the report that we published is trying to begin to open up as a conversation. I think also Riverford is a larger business where they were able to invest in the and cover the costs of setting this up, both legal and in terms of governance. But what our report is trying to do is to show that this isn't just an option for larger businesses. It's also a possibility for small and medium-sized enterprises, so under 250 employees and significantly smaller than that. There is no size barrier here, but I think that involves learning from other businesses and identifying how the best way to go about it is.
Is there a sweet spot in terms of the size of businesses that can benefit from employee ownership? I mean, are some just too big, and conversely, are some just too small?
Well, you could definitely argue that in a smaller business, it's easier to build those relationships that maintain the kinds of participation and communication that's needed. As a business grows, and this is a challenge for Riverford, it becomes spread over a wider geography. So you'll have people working 200 miles away from the main centre where most of the decisions are made. And so in many respects, a small business can definitely benefit from this and potentially doesn't need such complex governance in order to realize its value. So I think these are definite possibilities for this kind of smaller enterprise.
The report calls for increased government support to streamline and perhaps to incentivise employee ownership transitions. This ought to be right in the Labour government's wheelhouse. So have you had any response from the government so far?
Well, it's early days yet in terms of the Labour government's tenure, and our report has only been published for a few days. But I think what we need here is a groundswell of voices. It's been a real opportunity to work with Riverford. They've been very open about their experience, and they want other businesses to be able to share that knowledge, to benefit from that knowledge. That's what we need to do. We need to start these conversations. We need to raise awareness, and hopefully that will lead to change and more support.
That was Professor Emma Bell from the Open University. More news as ever on our website 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.